Dead Men Kill by L. Ron Hubbard. In a voice which held the icy tones of death, the dark-clothed man in the open doorway rasped.
I have come to kill you, Gordon. I have come to kill you.
Gordon stiffened in his massive chair. His ruddy face went ashen. His thick fingers clutched at the corners of his desk.
Jackson!
The killer's eyes were glassy. His hands reached out before him, grasping, talon-like. The pallor of the dead was on his wasted face. He was clothed in the garments of the grave. Silently, relentlessly, he walked forward.
Stop! My God, Jackson, what have I ever done to you?
I have come to kill you.
The clutching hands came closer. Gordon covered his face, tried to cower away. Beside him was a telephone. Furtively, he reached out for it.
Police!
Cried Gordon into the receiver. If Jackson heard, he gave no sign. His hard, glassy eyes, sunken and horrible, were fixed on his victim's throat. Gordon stared up and caught the odor which had assailed him from the first. It was the smell of moist earth mingled with the perfumes of the undertaking parlor, the stench of the grave.
I have come to kill you, Gordon.
My God, Jackson, get away!
Too late. Gordon tried to scramble out from behind his desk. Jackson lunged, hands convulsing. When the sunken eyes were a foot away from Gordon's, the fingers snapped down on the victim's throat. There was a shriek and the crash of the overturned chair. Gordon whipped about, writhing under the maniacal strength of the hands. Shuddering sobs were coming from the victim's distorted mouth. Slowly, the body under the hands relaxed and lay still. Jackson's fingers still clutched the throat. Seconds ticked by before the murderer moved. Then, with his expressionless face turned toward the door, he walked slowly from the room. Inspector Leonard rushed from his desk into the squad room and spotted Detective Sergeant Terry Lane.
Lane, snap into it. Gordon's been murdered, and I think it's a clue on your Burnham killing. The man on the switchboard heard Gordon shout, "My God, Jackson, get away! Into the phone! Get out there right away!"
Detective Sergeant Terrence Lane needed no further word. Like a shot, his wiry figure hurried through the door, plunged down a flight of steps, and swung aboard the scout car at the curb.
The Gordon resident. It's Stefan.
Car roared up the street. Lane hanging to the running board, his blue eyes flashing, the wind tearing at his raven black hair. If Detective Lane was disheveled, he had good reason to be. For a week, he had been on the trail of a killer he could never reasonably expect to apprehend. Since that fatal day, 7 days before, when Edward Burnham, head of a power trust, had been found dead in his home, Lane's life had been a nightmare. He had not known which way to turn, since the only conceivable clue had pointed the guilt to Hamilton, secretary to Burnham. And that was impossible, for Hamilton had been dead and buried for 2 weeks. Lane sprinted up the steps, kicked open the front door, and stepped inside. Worry flicked across Lane's lean, nervous face, and he looked down at his feet. There, in the center of the hallway, lay a blue-gray cotton glove. When he picked it up, Lane again smelled that faint odor. Suddenly, he recognized it. It was the pallbearer's glove that he had found, and from it came the stench of moist earth and sickening perfume, the odor of the grave. Jamming his first clue into his pocket, Lane ran into the room at his right and then stopped abruptly. Gordon was sprawled on the floor, rigid and staring. His once dapper clothes were ripped about the throat. The flesh beneath his jaw was blue and swollen. Lane stepped forward with a shudder. From the street came the noise of sirens and screeching brakes, heralding the arrival of the wagon and the coroner. The coroner was the first man in the door. He was small and wizened, with a military mustache adding an incongruous note of jauntiness. Dr. Charles Reynolds was entirely too professional to be awed by the sight of a corpse.
Hello. I don't need my stethoscope to tell that bird's stone dead.
Deader in hell. Strangled. Fellow that did that must have been a maniac.
Just the same thing we found in the Burnham case. Any clue?
Nothing definite. I wish there was.
He looked up to see that 4 bluecoats had come in.
Go through your routine, boys, but I'm afraid it won't mean a thing.
Monahan came in, herding a scared butler in front of him.
This egg says he ain't seen nothing, Sergeant.
Lane gave the butler a brief scrutiny.
Who was Jackson?
I don't know anything about it, sir. Jackson, sir. He was Mr. Gordon's secretary. He was buried last week, sir.
Oh, Christ. Another of those things. What did Jackson die of?
I don't rightly know, sir, but it was some sort of fever. There was nothing between Jackson and Mr. Gordon, sir. Jackson was a mighty fine young man. When he died, sir, we felt very bad.
And we're supposed to believe Jackson rose from the grave and killed Gordon? Zombies. The Walking Dead. Like they're supposed to have in Haiti? Rot. I've been there, and I never saw any.
I'll handle this, Reynolds.
Lane drew the pallbearer's glove out of his pocket and thumped it in front of the butler's nose.
Ever seen this before?
Yes, sir. That is, I think so, sir. I bought those gloves very special for Mr. Jackson's funeral.
Then you wore this glove as a pallbearer.
No, sir. I bought it for Mr. Jackson, sir. He had a very large hand, he did. That was on him when we lowered him into the grave, sir.
What? Well, I'll say this much, Lane. The man that strangled Gordon had very large hands. The thumbprints say so. Nothing else I can do here, now.
He picked up his black bag and the door closed after him as he disappeared down the hall.
You say that Gordon liked Jackson?
Yes, sir. All of us did, sir.
The door opened again, and a small, severely dressed gentleman came in. He was Dr. Anton Kaler, who sometimes interested himself in crime, though his chosen professions were chemistry and traveling.
Hello, Kaler. How did you get in?
Told the officer at the door I was a friend of yours.
I'm glad you happened along. Maybe you can give me a hand on this thing.
But certainly, I saw the police cars and thought it might be of help. You see, I know Gordon quite well, or rather, I did know him well.
There was a step outside, and Reynolds stepped briskly back into the room.
Forgot my gloves.
He leaned beside the body and picked up a pair of gloves. The light from the windows danced in the odd snake-shaped emerald on the ring he wore.
Like to stick around? Dr. Kaler may be able to give us a different slant on this thing. Dr. Kaler, this is Dr. Reynolds, the coroner. This is another of those cases. A fellow by the name of Jackson murdered Gordon. Did you know his secretary, Jackson?
Why, yes, he was quite a personable young chap. He died last week, you know. I attended his funeral. Poor devil, you certainly didn't deserve this.
The detective sergeant took a turn about the room and then came back to the door. There, beside the wall, was a scrap of paper which had escaped his first examination. He picked it up idly.
What the devil? Here's a pharmacy bill from Port-au-Prince, Haiti. What could this be doing here?
It says it hereby renders the account of Dr. LaRue to date. My lord, that thing's made out for 50,000 gourds. Why, that's $10,000 in our money.
$10,000? Whoever heard of pharmacies charging 10,000 smackers for anything? Dr. LaRue, huh? Well, if LaRue's got anything to do with this killing, he'll be spilling me the beans by dark.
Never heard of a Dr. LaRue in this city.
May I see it for a moment? I've spent considerable time in Haiti, you know. Well, if you want my opinion, Lane, I don't think that this has much connection with the murder. This pharmacy is a pretty reputable one in Port-au-Prince. Probably Gordon had some dealings with the man there. You know, he's traveled, or rather did travel, quite a little.
I may be funny, but I've got a hunch that this has some bearing on the case.
He walked quickly to the entrance of the room and then stopped as though he had been smashed in the face. There, on the inside of the door, where he could not have seen it before, was a note. The paper was held up by a knife driven through its flap. The hilt of the weapon was also green and was carved in the semblance of a snake. Lane ripped it down, shoved the knife in his pocket, and read the message.
Terry Lane, you will leave this case immediately and resign from the force. If not, you will be killed as suddenly, as unexpectedly, and as horribly as either Burnham or Gordon.
The signature was also in green. The two words at the bottom left no clue to the writer's identity. Loup Garou. The detective choked and whirled to see that the policemen, Reynolds and Kaler, were all staring at him. He smiled thinly, shrugged, and went out of the house with the missive in his coat pocket. On the steps were newspapermen, and at Lane's appearance, a barrage of questions ripped through the air.
Was it the same as Burnham?
If Jackson's been dead a week, how could he possibly murder Gordon?
Who do you suspect?
Lane was on the sidewalk trying to worm his way through the gathering crowd. Hands tore at him. People stared in his direction. Cameras snapped hungrily. One hand in particular was insistent. Lane gazed back at its owner with annoyance. And then his annoyance faded, for the owner of the white hand was a vividly beautiful girl. In spite of his worries, Lane stopped abruptly, satisfied for the moment, just to fill his eyes with this vision. About him, people snickered, and he quickly plunged on, dragging the girl with him until they stood a good 100 feet away from the nearest of the morbid crowd.
You had something to say to me?
Yes, but this isn't the place.
Come up to headquarters with me.
He turned quickly to hail a cruising cab, and when it had stopped, Lane said,
Let's get going, miss.
He reached back for the girl's arm to help her into the machine, and then he stopped and stared quickly about him. But the girl was gone. On Detective Sergeant Lane's desk, there lay a weird assortment of articles, and each time Inspector Leonard marched past on his endless stride up and down the room, he looked at the objects. First, there was the blue-gray glove. Next came the Haitian pharmacy bill. Then there were the note and the knife with the snake handle.
But Inspector, if I can't open the grave, how the devil do I know whether or not this guy Jackson is still buried?
It's your case.
Yeah, but how about a little cooperation? I've tried to connect with Jackson's family. I can't exhume that body without an order.
Lane picked up the note he had found on the door.
And as for this thing, how the devil could it get there? Whoever wrote it knows I'm on the case, and they think I've got the evidence.
Did you find out what that signature Loup Garou means?
It means the human hyena. Is that gruesome enough for you? It's part of a voodoo fetish. One of the priests or something in a black magic cult.
Well, if you can't do anything but sit there and twiddle your thumbs, I'd take that note's advice and resign.
Yeah, I suppose you would. I can't seem to set my teeth into anything. Here's this business of a green serpent and a human hyena or wolf, and next comes LaRue, who can't even be located. The only way I can find out if dead men really are coming back to life and killing is by digging up Jackson. And you won't let me do it. All right, I'm no ghoul, and I didn't think I'd ever dig graves, but order or no order tonight, I'm going to exhume Jackson. If I'm caught, well, what the devil, it couldn't be worse.
The cemetery was ringed by giant weeping willow trees which swayed under the ghostly moan of the night wind. Under the light of the half moon, white tombstones stood out spectrally. A shiver ran up Lane's spine, but he straightened his shoulders, hefted shovel and pick.
Remember teeth that note might have had? They'll sink now if ever.
He looked about him across the dead white array of marble rows, glanced up at the shadows the trees made against the sky, and then began the task of finding Jackson's grave. One by one, he inspected the stones, careful not to tread upon the mounds.
William Jackson, by his ever-loving sister.
Lane stared about him, and then with a sigh of repulsion sank his pick into the mound. At last his shovel scraped against metal. Redoubling his efforts, he undermined the casket until he could stand to one side. Lane wrapped his grimy fist about the half of his flashlight and pried up the other lid of the casket. The round beam of cold light probed into the interior. Then a low whistle escaped the detective, and he bent to look more closely. No, there was no mistake. The coffin was empty. As he stood beside the casket, trying to make himself realize that he was not a victim of an hallucination, small clods of dirt fell from above and struck his head. Lane froze with horror, and he felt the dread premonition of a presence. He whirled suddenly, stepped to one side. The icy beam of his light bit up toward the sky and lit up the ghastly face of a dead man. There was no mistake. Lane knew that the man was a corpse. The lips moved slowly. The voice was harsh but toneless.
I have come to kill you, Lane.
Lane braced himself for a spring upward and felt tentatively for his gun. Then he writhed inwardly as he realized that he had left it with his coat on top of the ground. What a fool he was. Again, the detective was about to leap up when he caught sight of another movement to the right. He changed the beam of his light, and there again was the expressionless face of a corpse. Another movement across the grave, another change of the light, and still another death mask. Lane felt his blood freeze in his veins as he realized his peril. 3 men, dressed in the black of the grave, were about to take his life. It was not until now that Lane really understood the look of horror on the faces of Burnham and Gordon. But he also knew that he was about to die. There was no fighting or killing that would serve against men already dead. He lunged for the legs of the first one he had seen and felt his arms close around solid flesh. The figure reeled back, dragging Terry out of the grave. The detective let go. He rolled to one side. He tried to scramble to his feet, but like maniacs, the 3 were upon him, pinning him down. Lane caught a glimpse of an expressionless face and saw grasping hands reach out for his throat. He struck out savagely, and his fist thudded against clammy flesh. The man's expression did not change. He did not reel. The hands came closer. But before he could recover himself, he sensed a presence behind him. He tried to spin about, but he was too late. Icy, bony fingers were closing about his windpipe. He struggled, tried to writhe away, but the thing which had him was not to be eluded. The hands tightened with a strength that was demoniacal. The whole ghastly scene had begun to spin before Terry's tortured eyes. In a moment, then a harsh voice cut through the night, an ugly, snarling voice.
Drop him! Drop him! Drop him!
The trio backed away. The fingers about Lane's windpipe relaxed and allowed him to sink down on the sod. He gasped hoarsely for breath, unable for the moment to offer further resistance. Dimly, he saw that a fourth member of the party was approaching. Lane almost welcomed his appearance, for he knew that the man was alive and human. Staccato orders were snapped about by the fourth man, while the three who had attacked Lane stood stiffly, looking straight ahead, seeing nothing out of their dead eyes. Then the three bent down, and before Lane could move, they picked him up in clammy arms and bore him away toward the rusty gates of the cemetery. After an interval of several minutes, the group approached a black limousine, which was parked on the side of the road. The lithe one rasped an order and took hold of a door handle. Lane was dropped to the gravel. The three men who had carried him backed away, staring straight ahead out of sightless eyes. The car door opened suddenly, flooding the roadside with a strange greenish light, which blended with that of the moon.
Get in. Do not try to get away. I have you covered. Those dead men would only be too glad to track you down if you tried to escape.
Lane blinked at the light. He climbed stiffly to his feet, shrugged and stepped inside the car. A man, clad in a black overcoat and hat, sat on the far side of the limousine. The man's face was entirely obscured by a green mask. The car's occupant thrust an automatic savagely into Lane's side, and in spite of himself, the detective winced from the pressure of the barrel. Still, he thought, hot lead was by far preferable to eternity at the hands of dead men.
You found Jackson gone?
Yes. Seems to have walked out on us. Have I the doubtful honor of talking with Luke Garou?
You have.
The human hyena, eh? I have something you want?
Quite right. You have a certain pharmacy bill addressed to a Dr. LaRue of this city. I must have that bill.
The last sentence was harshly punctuated by a thrust of the automatic muzzle deeper into the detective's side.
And after you get that?
Who knows? The other part of my bargain is your resignation from the force.
I see. You don't want to kill me right away. You'd rather have me resign so you can pin something on me and kill me afterwards.
I want the pharmacy bill, Lane. As far as killing goes, I don't care when you die.
Luke Garou paused to see what effect this last had on the detective. But if he looked for fright, he was mistaken.
You can buy your life with that bill and your resignation. I want the bill now.
Lane shrugged bleakly, sudden hopelessness on his face. Slowly, he reached back toward his hip pocket as though searching for the required slip of paper. The automatic tightened against him. Cautiously, he leaned even harder against the weapon's barrel. Then, as swiftly as a striking snake, he snatched at Luke Garou's wrist. Instead of pushing the gun away from him, he pulled it toward him. Luke Garou pulled the trigger, not realizing that the slide had been pushed back and that the firing pin would never touch the cartridge. Lane smiled grittily. He drew back his right fist and swung it straight for the masked one's jaw. Luke Garou struggled for an instant. He pulled the gun back and again pressed the trigger. Flames stabbed into Lane's side. Then his fist came back and traveled a second short arc to the masked one's jaw. A bellow of rage came as Luke Garou sank unconscious to the floor. Swiftly, he plunged for the driver's seat. A bullet from the outside shattered the glass beside his head. It seemed an age before he found the switch and an eternity before the car's motor barked into life. A hard grin of victory was on Lane's face as he saw the long, moonlit road unwinding ahead. He turned to make sure of his captive. Then, when he turned, Lane's grin faded. The car's door was swinging open and the back seat was empty. Reynolds pulled at his short briar pipe and gave Terry Lane a judicial look.
You needn't worry about those powder burns in your side. They'll heal up in a day or so, maybe a week. Did you get anything in return for it?
That's what I want to know.
Snapped Inspector Leonard from the doorway of Lane's office.
I found out that the car I swiped was registered under the name of Dr. LaRue. And I found out that Jackson's grave is empty. And I know that the Haitian pharmacy bill is worth something. Isn't that about enough for one night's work?
You rob a grave, steal a car, get shot up, and lose your arrest? Well, that's successful, I suppose.
Say, listen.
Now, he doesn't mean anything, Terry.
And then, with the doctor's license, he added,
Be nice to him. I just noticed the other day that his blood pressure is way up. He'll be popping off on us any minute.
Yes? Huh. Why, you old fossil? Wait a minute. Your phone's ringing, Terry.
Lane picked up the instrument, faintly bored. He spoke for a moment, then sat bolt upright.
When? This afternoon at 3. Yes, sir, Mr. Morton. We'll be there.
He whirled on Leonard.
Morton's secretary just died.
You mean Morton the banker?
Yes, Morton the banker. His secretary, the private one, has had a fever for a few days, and now he's dead. Morton received an extortion note a few days ago, and he refused to listen to it. Told the gang he was too broke.
Morton broke? What else?
He wants Reynolds and me to come to the funeral and make sure that Kramer, the secretary, is really dead. This looks like Luke Garou all over again.
And Lane regarded the knife on his desk with the snake handle.
If Morton's killed, I'm going to string both of you up to the nearest telegraph pole. Get me? The newspapers will have this thing on the streets inside the hour. If you slip up, it means both our jobs. If Kramer isn't dead, by God, Reynolds, fix him up so there won't be enough of him to walk. Do you get me?
When I leave that place, believe me, Kramer will be permanently dead.
The funeral procession, which was lined up at the door of the undertaking establishment, was long. It was evident that Kramer had many friends, and that Morton, in spite of his terror, was making an occasion out of it.
Is that undertaker reliable?
I reckon so. He's the biggest in town. Let's wander over to see Galt, the undertaker.
They walked through the throng on the sidewalk and glanced about them, spotting 3 or 4 of the men Lane had placed to watch the crowd for possible mugs. The detective followed Reynolds up the steps of the building and then stopped abruptly. There, beside the rail, was the girl who had disappeared after the Gordon murder. She was looking straight into the detective's eyes, and he felt a giddy sensation on the top of his head. She stepped up to him quickly.
I want to see you after you come out. It's a matter of greatest importance. I don't dare be seen talking to you.
Then she turned and hurried away before he could say anything. Lane found the coroner near the door. Galt, the undertaker, replete in afternoon formal clothes, met them as they stepped inside.
And what is it, gentlemen? You are friends of the unfortunate deceased?
Lane flipped open his coat and displayed his badge. He gazed narrowly at Galt before he spoke and saw that the man had glanced furtively to the right and left.
We want to inspect the corpse.
But certainly, step right this way, gentlemen. Mr. Kramer is lying in state.
He quickly led the way to the side of the coffin. The detective gazed down at the dead face of Kramer and failed to repress a shudder. Perhaps in a short time, Kramer would be one of the walking dead.
Of course, if the police wish to inspect, who am I to stop them?
He pulled up the lid and began to unbutton Kramer's shirt front. The coroner pulled a heavy stethoscope from his pocket and hooked it into his ears to press it against the dead man's heart. He finally shrugged.
No doubt about it, Terry. This is one of the deadest stiffs I've ever seen.
The detective ran his handkerchief over his forehead. Then he put the bit of silk back in his breast pocket. He faced Galt.
You took care of Hamilton and Jackson?
Yes, I have, I might add, the largest undertaking business in town.
Well, get along with your undertaking and be darn sure that you bury Kramer good and deep. Get me?
But Galt was not permitted a chance to answer. The chattering snarl of a machine gun bit through the hum of the crowd. The piercing screams of bullet-hacked people split the air. Lane raced for the entrance, knocking aside the surging, panic-stricken crowd. He paused on the steps and looked out into the street. Horror spread over his face. At the other curb, sprawled in his scout car, was Police Officer Monahan. His face shot away, splattered with his life blood. The detective threw off the horror which had momentarily swept over him. From the steps, he looked at the wrecked squad car. Evidently, Monahan had been coming away from the curb on the undertaker's side of the street when the death blast raked him. Dead, instantly at the wheel, Monahan had not stopped the rush of the car across the street, and it had piled up against the opposite curb, injuring two men who had stood in its path. Lane nodded at his men.
Clear that up. Check up on the gun and the ballistics.
The detective moved with leaden feet across the asphalt to the side of the wrecked squad car and stood for some seconds quietly regarding it. The coroner had followed and stood nearby, silently watching the grim scene. Then, once again, Lane stiffened and stared. Pinned on Monahan's chest was a note addressed to Terry Lane, and it was written in green ink.
Terry Lane. Just a hint that I want that bill. Get off this case, or loot the room.
The crowd, morbid and shuddering, was drawing in toward the wreck. Impatiently, Lane tried to sweep them back, pocketing the note as he did so. Bluecoats were coming up, ringing the machine while the plainclothesmen worked. Then he caught a glimpse of a familiar figure. Dr. Anton Kaler was on the edge of the crowd, leaning on his cane, surveying the wreck with a judicial eye. Lane moved toward him.
Sort of scooped you, didn't they? It's ugly work.
Uh-huh. This is one swell mess. Listen, Doc, I want to ask a favor of you. You know something about Haiti, don't you?
A little.
Well, I want you to check up on this pharmacy bill for me, will you?
Certainly. Glad to be of any help I can. You've learned that, haven't you?
Of course, Doc. And I want you to check up on this one other thing.
Wait a minute. Let one thing ooze through my poor brain at a time, will you? First of all, where's the bill so that I can get the address?
Here's a photostat of the original.
Now, what else?
I want you to check up on black magic for me.
Oh, you don't expect a chemist of my standing to believe in anything like that, do you?
No. But seriously, I want to know all about the green serpent and the human hyena that steals people for sacrifice, and just how far voodoo magic can run. Will you?
All right. I'll delve through the wee hours and get you the works. That all?
That's all for now. Be seeing you.
And Lane moved back through the crowd, remembering suddenly that he had promised to meet the girl. He walked down past the line of cars, which were still drawn up for the funeral. A low voice came to him, and he stopped to look about. Then he saw the door of a gray, custom-built sedan swing open, and a slim arm beckoned to him. People were all about him, and he trusted their very number to hide his movements. It was evident that the girl wanted secrecy. Quickly, the detective stepped into the machine and slammed the door behind him.
I have waited long to talk with you. My name is Dawn Drayden, and I am one of the entertainers at the Club Haitian. I have wanted to talk with you about these crimes. Do you have any proof of the identity of the murderers? Is it a fact that dead men are actually coming back from the grave and killing their employers?
Yes, dead men are doing the killing.
He looked out through the curtain and saw that the procession was starting off. The chauffeur of the gray sedan was putting their machine in motion. The girl glanced quickly about and then looked back at Lane.
I wanted to give you some tips. Perhaps you can use them. Morton is next on the docket. He'll be dead by tomorrow.
You interest me, but if you'll pardon my saying so, I've got a hunch I'm playing with dynamite.
What do you mean?
Well, to put it bluntly, I expect to run up against Loup Garou within the next few minutes. And if I do, it's going to be a showdown.
You mean you think that
That you're on the inside. I figure that you're probably next to LaRue. You're spilling this to me just for a play, aren't you?
Annoyance flashed across the girl's beautiful face, and she came so close to Lane that he again received a whiff of the perfume.
Don't get me wrong, Mr. Lane. If the truth were known, I'm the only one that can pull you out of an awfully deep mire. When all this is over, I'm going to ask only one thing, and you're going to grant that favor first.
I don't like the idea of promising anything rash.
This won't be anything rash. It's something fine and humane. I'm only afraid that you will be too blind to it after you finish the case. I'll help you to the limit if you'll grant that favor first, sight unseen, now.
All right, it's granted. Sight unseen. Now, let's have something else.
It's necessary that you take this Dr. LaRue alive. Otherwise, you'll never be able to prove his identity or grant me my favor. You have a difficult task before you. It so happens that Loup Garou thinks that you have evidence of his identity, or that you can trace him. I don't know about that. At any cost, he is going to remove you from his path.
You mean he'll blast me?
No, nothing as crude as machine gunning. It would be something very subtle and delicate, like torture. But there's one thing you must be careful to remember. Do not.
A hard crash broke the comparative silence about them. For an instant, Terry thought it was the backfire of a car, but then he knew that he was wrong. The driver of the gray sedan pitched sideways on the front seat, blood spurting from a hole in the side of his head. Dawn Drayden opened her carmine mouth to scream, but no sound came forth. Before Lane could reach for his gun, two things happened. The live individual of past experience slipped in under the wheel. The car door swung open, and a man with a black coat and hat stepped in from the machine which had come up beside them. The intruder looked up. A moment before, his face had been obscured by his hat, but now he brought to view a green mask.
Don't move.
Snapped Loup Garou with a suggestive movement of his automatic. Calmly, he shut the door, drew out the extra seat in front of them, and sat down. His eyes glittered from the slits of his mask. Lane silently cursed himself for not having been on the guard for such a move.
Nice work, Dawn. I'll remember you in my next paycheck.
Lane shot a horrified, sidewise glance at the girl. A sardonic smile scarred her beauty. Then it was true that she was in the pay of this fiend. The detective knew that he had been duped into a very clever trap.
It isn't every detective who has the privilege of knowing beforehand who commits a murder. You see, Lane, Morton will be dead before sunrise.
Go on. You interest me.
You know, Lane, it isn't every man that gets the chance to converse with the dead.
Meaning?
What do you think? Suppose you want me to think that you're dead, too. Nice idea. Before we were so rudely interrupted last night, we were talking about a pharmacy bill. You gave a photostat to a chemist. You asked him to check up on it. Evidently, you do not know the secret. I want the bill and all other photostats.
Lane said nothing. His silence shouted a negative.
Then, I shall have to take you to a certain place I have in mind. Incidentally, Lane, the chemist will be waylaid tonight and robbed.
You can't count on that puppy.
Don Drayden stared straight in front of her, still smiling as though faintly amused by the proceedings. Lane's blue eyes narrowed with disgust as he looked at her. The detective was thinking rapidly, trying to piece out a case and devise a method of escape at the same time.
If you look out the window, you'll find that night has fallen. Perhaps that will make you understand that there is little hope of rescue for you.
Before he thought twice, Lane pulled aside the curtain absently and glanced out. Luke Garou leaned swiftly forward and reversed the gun in his hand, holding it by the muzzle. The gun butt came up and then lanced down to thud solidly against Lane's head. Slowly, Lane sank forward, jolting under the motion of the car. Luke Garou eyed the body speculatively and then swooped down and quickly retrieved the papers in Lane's coat. From the pack, he extracted the original of the pharmacy bill and 2 photostats. He shrugged again and turned the gun around until it pointed at Lane's head. The finger closed down on the trigger.
Don't!
Why not?
I couldn't stand it. Haven't you killed enough men for one day? The chauffeur, that woman, and the officer, aren't they enough?
What's one more man, more or less?
You might at least use him.
Ah, you have brains after all, haven't you? Why, if I use Lane, I'll throw the entire force into a panic. That's capital. I can kill him and have him buried, and he can kill Leonard.
The laugh was shattering, terrifying. Don Drayden's face relaxed into a smile.
You'll know my worth yet, Dr. LaRue.